technology is going to do. But yeah, so all right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Our first question, welcome. Thank you for joining us on the Ask Us Anything with PB&G. And the questions keep coming in. We really appreciate that. And if you're watching this and you've got more questions or haven't had a chance to share one, please know that you can email us. You can email them to me. My email address is just the name Brian, BRIAN, at FBCBLM.org. And we'll share them, Gabriel and I, and we'll engage that. Otherwise, you can call the office. Those of you who are in the Bloomington Normal area, you can stop on in at the church, put a note in. We have a drop box for the questions. So if you've got a question, just want to ask anonymously, welcome to do that. First question is, how do you balance the desire to be a good Samaritan with personal safety issues? For example, if a stranger approaches you alone in a dark parking lot on a cold night and says she needs a place to stay and the shelters are full until tomorrow. This happened to me and her one night a few years ago. I was startled, a bit afraid, and unprepared. I gave her a restaurant gift certificate that I had in my purse, but I was afraid to invite her in my car or take her home with me. Yeah, absolutely. Really good question and really practical question, obviously, as you know, this is kind of something that you encountered. And, Gabriel and I kind of talked about this one just a little bit, so I'm going to, let you jump in first if you'd like, or.
Yeah, I mean, there's always risk involved. And, anytime you're helping somebody, there's always a risk you're going to be taken advantage of, but you don't want to have a risk to your safety. But you kind of want to have a plan for if this happens, if you find yourself in this situation. Yeah. We've had times when someone has called us because they don't necessarily know the resources or they are alone and don't want to make a decision that is unsafe. So if you have somebody that knows that you maybe talk to ahead of time, would you be somebody I could call if a situation like this comes up? And say, okay, hold on, I'm calling somebody, we will figure something out together, would be one option, particularly for women, being alone, we tend to unfortunately be more vulnerable in situations like that. But and if shelters are full, then you kind of want to have a list of what are some other resources. And, if it's after dark, a place like Path would be closed. But sometimes you can get somebody into a hotel room, particularly if you have a connection with a church. Sometimes they have relationships with nonprofits where they can get somebody in basically at cost. But again, that would be something where you would want to have sort of your partner, whoever that is, in helping people out, to be there with you.
It's awkward, right? Because one of the things that makes it challenging is that there's no way you can prepare for every eventuality, and a lot of times people's situations, for a number of reasons, are going to be kind of messy. Sometimes it's just complicated. And I really appreciate, Gabriel, what you said about you don't have to do it alone. And part of the reality is having somebody that you can. Sorry, we've got the audience. Yeah, why don't you go ahead and get it?
Just be easier.
So, having somebody else that you can connect to, and I guess a part of that would be in the midst of trying to respond well. You don't have to let yourself be pressured into or guilted into having to do something on a specific timeline. Now, yes, sometimes the needs are an emergency. This is, you got to use some sense of where that's tugging on you. But I guess part of my advice would be to not let someone push you or guilt you into do something that you're not comfortable with. Because that's kind of it can happen, right? Because there's a difference between being taken advantage of financially, and being pushed into a situation that's just maybe not safe or not good. It's important to understand where some of those boundaries are, and you do, and that's so the Good Samaritan, you know, was aware of what that road was, kind of was taking a risk, was taking a calculated risk, I would assume. And I think you're going to need to cover Jasmine up. So that's just,
Sorry.
we have cockatoo problems right now. She's not the center of attention, and that just makes things complicated and potentially interesting for us. So, um, but, you know, to come around to that is having a sense of being prepared to have some numbers to call. So preparing ahead as much as you can is one thing might be, what are some of the resources? Now, just because you're told that the shelters are full, they may be or they may not be. And being able to have somebody that you can rely on, to like somebody at the church, you can call me, you can ask us. I mean, that's kind of what, emergencies happen. We'll network. Um, and sometimes it's just having some of those numbers like 211 or PATH or emergency shelters, that sort of a thing. And so that you're not the only person trying to work that out or to solve that. It's not a bad idea sometimes to have a kit of things that you might carry. So maybe a $5 gift certificate to a fast food restaurant to hand somebody if they're hungry. And that may not meet all of their needs, but if it's so, just having options to care for someone. We've pulled off the side of the road to help somebody at times. But I think it's important to be aware of your surroundings, be aware of, is this public, is this not public, am I alone, am I not. So, being a good Samaritan, doing the right thing, doesn't mean don't try to be safe in the midst of all of that. And if there are things that you'd like to do ahead of time to prepare, whether it's like a gift card or sometimes having a bag of necessities, things like toiletries, underwear, socks, things that if somebody is in need, you can just say, hey, here you go, if this helps. Again, it's very situational, and you want to be careful, not just throwing things at people and not addressing as you can the situation. But buying a hotel room is kind of a big thing.
Yeah. And sometimes, there are situations that are just too messy or complicated to help in the moment. And yeah, I mean, we had a situation one very cold night that took up many hours and many miles, and ended up because some choices had been made earlier, that the person's options, they just did not have options that were very viable, and the ones they did have, they kind of didn't want, and we were not able to make those choices for the person.
Right.
And so eventually we just had to walk away, and that was kind of what was maybe not best, but we could not make those choices on behalf of the person. So
right. That's just hard. I think maybe a piece of this that differentiates, I mean, staying rooted in the story of the Good Samaritan, right, is these people who walked on by, right, didn't even try to get involved, just kind of pretended that the situation didn't happen. I think there's a difference there between, just passing on by and engaging the person as a human being, treating them with dignity, treating them with respect, looking them in the eye and just saying, I'm sorry, I can't fix this for you right now. I mean, sometimes that's the reality of it. But to do what we can to try to wrestle through that, to see if we can collaborate, network, bring things together, that's part of it. And, the reality is there are times where helping is going to put you outside of where you feel super comfortable, but you don't want to be necessarily unsafe in the process. And I guess I just affirm that that's okay. Now, not an excuse to do nothing, but just maybe an understanding of doesn't necessarily mean you have to do everything, or that there may be some options that just aren't going to be viable for you in the moment. And that's the reality of it. I know that it's probably as unsatisfying to hear as it is to say, because I wish there was a magic answer for everything. But I would say it's pre-preparation to what you can, networking, and just kind of having a sense of your own awareness of what's going on in that particular situation. Sometimes people get by as a survival tactic, a survival method of being pushy, because they've been turned down so many times. They have learned they have to push a little bit, and just understand that. But don't be pushed into doing something you don't feel is good or is uncomfortable to do. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Boy, we're moving from one good, tough question into another good, tough question. And actually, this one's kind of a two-parter, because we had two different questions, two different people asking about the book of Job. So simple stuff. We'll be done in about 5 minutes. No, that's my sarcasm coming out. First question is, we know that God doesn't have to prove himself to the devil. The devil already knows the truth. Then why does God continue to make Job suffer? Even Job's closest friends turn against him. Yet Job did nothing wrong. What was God trying to prove, and who was this horrible sacrifice, that is Job's entire family and others, who was all of that for? And then there's another question related to Job, but it's kind of on a different dimension. So, yeah, great question. Thank you for asking that. So one of the starter questions when it comes to books of the Bible, especially with challenging books like this, as with the book of Revelation we talked about last week, is one of the key questions is where you start from. What are some of the starting understandings we bring to what this book is, what kind of literature it is within the Bible? Is it history? Is it prophecy? Is it apocalypse? Is it poetry? Is it something else? Because where we start with that, based on what it is, right? We don't just make up our mind and go, that's what that has to be, but we look at the book itself. What's the structure? What style of writing is it? What is the context, as best as we can understand it, that helps us, the clues within the text that help us try to understand how to approach it. And so, this is one of those, like Revelation, that there's a lot of different perspectives on, and it's important to try to understand where some of those different ways of approaching it are. I'm going to start, we're not going to exhaust this tonight. So if my answer is unsatisfying, which it very well may be, please consider that an invitation to further conversation. We can explore this more in depth and try to unpack it together a little bit more. So whether that's in person or if you want to ask, again, clarifying questions, be glad to try to do that. I do want to say, just as a foundational piece, we're approaching this, first of all, as whatever the question of genre is, that this is God's inspired word that was meant for the people of the time as well as for us. So it's not a question of authority. It's not a question of inspiration. It's a question of what kind of literature is it, and therefore, how do we approach it? Because sometimes that will not necessarily free us from all difficulties, but it will help us from focusing on pieces that it may not be trying to answer, which I suspect is one of the cases here in Job. One of the clues here that Job is, first of all, it's got poetic rhythm to it. It's got cycles of speeches and responses that are framed with this sort of a narrative bookend. First, you've got this sort of setting up of who is Job, and the circumstances that kind of lead to the heart of Job, which is the discussion that's back and forth between Job and his friends, that culminates in a divine answer that is not as much of an answer as we might like it to be, and yet that's also part of the point. So Job is very in that sense, very multifaceted, very complex. But I want to suggest that one of the key pieces of understanding Job is that whether or not there is a historical Job, um, I don't think that's the point. The more commentaries that I read, it almost doesn't matter if Job is based on a historical person or not, because the heart of it is actually setting up this theme, this core question that we can all kind of identify with on some level or another, and have for thousands of years. And it sets up in this sort of a wisdom literature context, which is a genre of literature in the Bible, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, even Song of Solomon to an extent, parts of the Psalms. There's this sort of wisdom of what does it mean to live well? What does it mean to live well in relationship with God? And what do you do when the world doesn't fit the neat categories that we think it ought to? And one of the reasons that I'll suggest that it's helpful to read Job as literature, divine literature, is that everything in Job is heightened. It's like, turned up to 11, if you borrow the Spinal Tap reference, is that everything is dramatized. It practically begins once upon a time. It starts, there once was a man named Job, and he was the most righteous person. And it goes to describe just how righteous he is. I mean, if you want any kind of standard of a good person that is beyond critique, that's Job. And then the worst of calamities. I mean, you could just kind of like, how can we make this any worse and describe it being any possibly more of a tragic thing than what happened to him and to his family? You can. I mean, you just get these bookends here. And so the question being, God doesn't have to prove himself to the devil. The devil already knows the truth. Absolutely. Both of those, absolutely true. One of the things that I'd suggest, though, is that when we look at Job, it's not the devil, it's Satan. Now, that seems like a distinction without a difference. But if we look at the meaning of the word, and you may find it in our English translations, a lot of times you'll find like a little footnote or something that says the accuser, ha-satan. And what I would invite us to see is not necessarily a fleshed out whole understanding of who the devil is, as Jesus refers to the devil, as the rest of the New Testament kind of expands on all of that. It's a function. The accuser, ironically, kind of like what we would call the devil's advocate. The person that says, but have you seen the other side? So to set up the heart of the discussion in Job, which really comes around a question of how do we understand justice when it's supposed to work like, if you are good, if you are blameless, if you are righteous, you will be protected and bad things won't happen to you. What if that doesn't work? Because in life, it doesn't happen that way all the time. There's one of the resources I was drawing on from this, again, the Jesus Creed commentary. Scott McKnight sort of organizes it, but there's a frequent commentator, frequent author of blog articles, as both a scientist and a Christian, and someone who, RJS, I don't know her full name, but she's written a lot of good stuff, and she wrote a series on Job that interacts with a number of commentaries. Tremper Longman III's Baker commentary on the Old Testament Wisdom and Psalms, John Walton NIV application commentary on Job, and August Kunkel on Job, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs in the Cornerstone Biblical Commentary. And I'm just going to quote her a little bit on this because I think it gets to some of this, is that some of the core questions, is it good policy for God to bless the righteous? Which is really the heart of the accuser's question, because the accuser is saying, basically, the only reason someone would be righteous, the only reason that someone would trust God is because good things happen to them. And therefore, what if, is that real loyalty? Is that real love? Interestingly enough, it's one of the reasons I'm not a Calvinist, in the sense of God's, the theological argument for God exercising meticulous control and defining that as God's sovereignty really doesn't leave room for human response to God. It doesn't leave room for genuine response to who God is in a relationship. So the devil's basically making the argument, Job only loves you because you bless him. So if those things are taken away, he's going to curse you. And then is it just when God allows righteous people to suffer? And so it sets this up. That's the dialogue back and forth and the drama that unfolds when Job doesn't. He holds those things in tension, that God, he will not curse God. He will not give up on God. But there's something that is not right in the way that he thinks the world ought to work. There's a tension here. He doesn't deserve what's happened to him. And in a way, he's right. It's interesting at the end of Job that God reflects back and says to his friends, to Job's friends, you have not spoken right of me as my servant Job has. So Job's been complaining this whole time. And when he comes face to face with God, he realizes he doesn't have an argument. He doesn't have the wisdom to be able to respond, to say, yeah, I know better than you do. And yet, in the wrestling, in the holding on to that tension, God honors that. Coming back to the question, though, why does God continue to make Job suffer? 2 points to that. One is actually, if we look at the text, God does not make Job suffer. What God does, and again, arguing the distinction, God allows the accuser to, within parameters, inflict suffering on Job. So you can say God is still ultimately responsible for that. Yes, I can understand that argument. But in the sense, there is a difference between what God permits and what God wills. And I would say in the context of what Job is, what I believe Job to be in the kind of literature it is, it's not something that we should think God is willing to just do this, that this reflects God's character. It's an exchange that sets up the argument. It has a narrative function, a story function to get at this deep question that then gets pointed back to at the end. You may not agree with that, and I understand that. So that's where different approaches to Job will come out different ways.
Maybe a bit like Scheherazade and the Arabian Nights. The framework of this story is the king who, marries a bunch of women in succession and murders each one the next morning. Mm-hmm. That is not what the story of 10,000 Arabian Nights is. Right. The story is a woman who just keeps telling stories. And so the point of this story is the series of stories, not the framework.
Right. Again, goes back to, well, what about the sacrifice? What about Job and his family? And again, this is going to be unsatisfying, I think, but in the sense of, I'm not sure that we should treat it as in that sense as history. Looking again at the history of interpretation of the book of Job, there's a lot of, this isn't just me, this is, there's a lot of support saying, that the clues here are really, it's really meant to draw us into the question by grappling with the level of injustice that's being depicted here. I mean, the story engages us and says, hey, that's not right. So the question is precisely coming from the place that it's meant to, right? So what's going on here? How does this work? But it draws us into, it's meant to draw us into that back and forth with Job and Job's friends. I would quote, again, I'm going to draw on RGS's response here. This book, and she's quoting Longman and Walton in their joint book on Job. This book is manifestly and unarguably in the genre category of wisdom literature rather than historical literature. It reads differently than, say, Chronicles or Kings or even, First and Second Samuel, or those kinds of books. We therefore adopt the position that though Job himself may have been a real person who actually lived, the rest of the book is a literary work of art providing a wisdom discussion that is framed by extremes and that allows us to consider the extreme and artificial scenario that the author has constructed so that we can engage in a deep investigation of an important philosophical issue without having to continually cope with the muddied waters and the normal ambiguities of people and their circumstances, which sounds real complicated, but think of it this way. If we were talking about something horrible that happened maybe to Gabriel and I, we're not perfect people. Gabriel's a little closer than I am, but you could make Job's friends' arguments a little bit more plausibly, right? Surely there's something that you've done that would have caused this or deserved this. I mean, the whole structure of Job is set up in such a way that you don't ask those, that's not the question. I mean, you're meant to understand that Job's friends are wrestling through the accepted wisdom of the time, the way that everybody said, well, that's the way the world works. So if something bad happened to you, you must have sinned. If you got sick, if your prayer didn't get answered, you didn't believe hard enough, right? And some of those things still linger on in our theology today. And really, that's where the gift of Job allows God to respond to that. And the answer is not, oh, this is the perfect formula. Now we've got the perfect answer. It's, we don't see things from God's perspective. There are some things that do not make sense in this world. And our challenge is, are we going to hang with God in the midst of that? Or are we going to give up on the wrestling? So I don't know. It's a really good question. I don't know that I completely answered that, at least the best way that I could right now. But definitely willing to re-engage that, and personal discussion if you want. We're glad to do that. I want to follow up with another question that was from another person, also about the book of Job. In the book of Job, Bildad the Shuhite, Eliphaz the Temanite, and Zophar the Naamite, where do they come from? Who are they? And also, if Job lived during the Israelite captivity, do you believe people of faith existed out of Israel? All right. One of my favorite verses. It's the only one with a hobbit in it, right? Bildad the Shuhite. If that's not a hobbit name, I don't know. Also the shortest person in the Bible, because he's only one shoe high, right? No, sorry. The reality is, and again, this goes back to one of the things that makes Job hard to grapple with is that even the Hebrew that it's written in, the dialect of Hebrew, is different from most of the rest of the Old Testament. It's got lots of words in it that don't appear anywhere else. And so it's been a challenge for translators all the way back from when they were translating Hebrew into Greek for the Septuagint, the Jewish version of our Old Testament. So Job is just complicated, and we're not sure actually where some of these folks are from, but we got some clues. Taman, as in Eliphaz the Temanite, is referenced as one of the important towns in the land of Edom, which is south of the Dead Sea, so in the southern part of Israel and Jordan kind of today. Shua doesn't appear in the Old Testament as a place name, but he is named, he does show up as one of Abraham's sons by Keturah. Don't know if that has any connection. Nama, they're not sure. They don't know where that's from. But all of those together, there are little clues, if you get really into it, that may point to all of them kind of being from the land of Edom, again, from the south. Timing-wise, that's another one of those things that a lot of commentators disagree on. It's not always as clear-cut as we'd like it to be. When were books of the Bible written? Who wrote them? It sure seems easy in our study Bibles, but then when you dig into it, you realize not everybody agrees. The evidence sometimes leans one way and sometimes it leans the other. And so it's hard to say. It may have been written. One of the scholarly ideas is that it was written during the exile, or afterwards. Seems like a number of other commentators lean just a little bit earlier, and so it's hard to say. But I do like the question: do I believe people of faith existed outside of Israel? And I guess here's fantastic question. That has a lot of broader implications, right? Well, to this, I'd point back to the Abraham story in Genesis. Number one, Abraham wasn't an Israelite, right? I mean, he didn't have the law, he didn't have Torah. All he did was trust that that when he encountered God, that God was actually talking to him, and he was willing to respond on that. So he and Sarah set out on the basis of this encounter with God, and that our New Testament tells us was credited to him as righteousness. So that's one. There's another, in a sense of, as we go through the book of Genesis, and I'm terrible with names sometimes. So there was a priest in the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek was, again, this was pre-Torah, this was pre-Israel, but was someone who served God and that Abraham responded to and gave a tithe of some income that he had received as a result of some of his actions to help intervene in a time of difficulty. And so there's this whole story of, people who are responding to the presence of God in different ways, where as God meets them where they are. So in one sense, people of faith exist outside of Israel. That doesn't mean that Israel isn't the way in which God is communicating in a unique way. That doesn't mean that Jesus is not the unique one who reveals God's character and God's salvation, and who uniquely reveals what it means to be human. But to say that there are people all over the place, God's Spirit is not limited, and that God is at work preparing people to receive fuller truth as we go on. So now, I will say, it's interesting. Was Job an Israelite? We don't even know that. We just know that he honored God and was trying to be righteous in everything that he did. And so that sets up then why didn't good things happen to him and to his family? I think, again, great questions. Sometimes there just really aren't all the answers that we want, like some of these particular things. Where was that place? Archaeology may answer that question. It's interesting. Even in the past 100, 200 years, we're still finding places that people before that weren't sure where they were or even whether they existed. And then we'll find some archaeological evidence that, helps us connect things.
Everybody thought the city of Troy was fictional and that, it was just another myth, and found out, nope, really did exist.
Absolutely. Yeah. Cool. All right. We've got, we're going to do a fun one here. So they're all fun, but maybe not as much straining on the brain here. Should I, let you? Yeah, there we go. That's a look. What are the challenges of being a pastor or being married to a pastor? So that's a fun question. I don't know. I'll pick on Gabriel first because I've been doing a lot of talking.
I want to see if Jasmine wants to come up.
Yeah. All right. So I'll give her
being very quiet and mellow. Speaking of, pastors' kids sometimes have a reputation. Ours sometimes can be challenging. I can say that because I was a pastor's kid growing up. I think no, she doesn't want to come out.
No, okay. All right.
Talking.
What it is.
I think, particularly the last 20, 30 years or so, things have kind of gotten easier for pastors' wives, particularly as more women are pastors now. And so Christian culture has kind of had to say, wait a minute, if we don't have those sort of expectations for the pastor's husband, why would we have them for a pastor's wife?
Yeah.
But yeah, there are some challenges that growing up in a pastor's household. There's a term called the stained glass fishbowl, which can sometimes apply that, you know, to a lesser degree now, but much more the case when I was growing up. A pastor's family is you know, a bit more of a fishbowl. You know, everybody watches the kids grow up, generally sit in the front pew, or if we couldn't behave ourselves, you know, on the organ bench with mom, or but you know, setting good boundaries and having friends outside of the church is important. We had someone in our church in Wisconsin who has since passed away, but had been her husband had been a pastor of the church for, I don't know how long, but for a while, and they'd come back when they retired. He had since died. Her son had also been a pastor of the same church, and so she set a lot of boundaries with other people for me, so that I didn't have to do that early on. And I could just, you know, I could easily say, no, I don't really want to fill that role that has traditionally been filled. You know, I don't want to do this particular thing. That is not my gift. That is not my calling. But I would like to do this other thing that a pastor's wife has not done before. So, yeah, I mean, part of it is just being able to set good boundaries, and definitely having friends outside of the church as well.
Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah. I have a feeling that I drag you into a lot of things, even trying not to volunteer you for stuff. But I don't know if you would name that as a challenge, but I do feel like sometimes that's something that happens, that you get drawn into things because I get drawn into them to an extent.
Sometimes, but if it's something I'm not willing to be drawn into, I will,
Yep.
I will put brakes on it and say, no, thank you.
Absolutely. So what are some of the challenges of being a pastor? I think, you know, Gabriel's really wise about talking about boundaries, because I think I learned one of those lessons that you're always continually relearning, but there's always more good things to do, even important things, than there is time to do them, or even my ability to do them. And maybe that circles back even around to the Good Samaritan question at the beginning, is that, yes, it is important to keep doing good things. We cannot do everything. We cannot fix everything. And that's another hard lesson, is, you know, to realize, actually, it may seem like the pastor has a lot of authority or power or things like that. And certainly there are those that try to act that way. But the reality, the deep reality is, there's very little that I can fix, right? So we can't fix each other. We can't make each other's problems necessarily go away. What we do is we point to the presence of God. We try to give of ourselves. We try to be present. But I don't do that. I don't cause that. And it's really important to stay in touch with that, because sometimes you can get into thinking that you can. But so some of the challenges of being the pastor are trying to figure out, for me at least, time. There's certain times where you just be very, very busy. And it's not necessarily, sometimes it's long hours, sometimes it's just scattered hours, right? So you got something going on in the morning, and then maybe you have a little bit of time in the early afternoon, but then you got another evening meeting, or you got to get ready for this or that. There's always something else to be doing. And that can be challenging. So to find ways to kind of break away. And thank you, Carolyn. You work harder than about anybody I know. So so I look up to you on that one. But so that's one of the challenges. I will say one of the other challenges is true, I think, in general, when you belong to a church community, when you're really involved and connected, it works like a very big family. And the more people you let into your life, the more joy you experience, the more friendship, the more giftedness. There's a great support there. There's also a lot of heartbreak, because you're also with people when life does not work out the way that they would hope or the way that you would hope for them. And it kind of ties back to Job in a way. You see people going through extremely difficult things, grief and loss, the loss of dreams, loss of jobs, loss of spouses, friendships, all of those sorts of things. That's hard, and it takes a toll. Over the years, the more time you spend with folks, and again, true of people who just simply are involved and participating in the church family, you have to say goodbye to a lot of folks. And in faith, we know that they are with God. They're in great hands, that we can trust God with those that we love. But the grief of missing them here and now is still there. There's a recognition of the passing of years, all of that. I would agree with Gabriel 100% that it's so important to also have friendships outside of the church and interests outside of just doing churchy things. So one of the reasons I got into astronomy or the rocketry thing or having other hobbies and stuff like that, that's an important emotional grounding for me.
You have, friends who are also in ministry who get it.
Yeah.
But also to have, people that are, outside of church culture in many ways. I had a knitting group when we were in Wisconsin that I belonged to, that one of them referred to the group as being my normal friends.
And now you can't say that because they're all your normal friends here.
And I told them, now I have like normal friends in normal, so that I never get tired of those jokes. But but yes, having friends that are outside of church in general is also good. You get a very different perspective than you do when you spend a lot of time with church people who are awesome people. But it is also good to see other perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be. I've been very blessed. I know that being a pastor, being in ministry can be very isolating, especially if the model of ministry that you've come up in is where the pastor does have all the answers and all the power and is the focal point of everything. It can be a really lonely place, and it can be a real dangerous place too, I think, if you drink too much of that Kool-Aid. Unfortunate reference there, but just in all seriousness, there are some dangerous places in that. I've been very blessed to have colleagues in an interfaith setting, in an ecumenical setting, colleagues within the American Baptist family, that we enrich each other, keep each other grounded, or at least still say, keep me grounded. And in the diversity of perspectives, and being able to just serve as a safe sounding board, because sometimes the things we wrestle with, when they emerge out of the ministry context or out of the church context, you can't normally necessarily talk about that with everybody in the church context because it's just not healthy. So you got to have places where confidentiality can happen, and you can talk about that kind of stuff, working your way through just how do you approach a certain ministry situation or that kind of thing. Those are some of the challenges of being a pastor, but there are so many blessings too. And I just have to acknowledge that gladly. Well, there are many other questions that folks asked that need to let sit for another time. So I do thank you. If I suspect some of you may be watching right now or watch it another time. If we didn't get to your question, we will. We've got it here, and really do appreciate them. So thank you so much. I'm going to wrap it up for now, but God bless you, and please feel free to engage. Thanks for jumping in on the chat. Yeah, Mason, Jazzy was just having a bad day today, or a bad moment. He's sulking.
Had a bit of a tantrum.
Yeah.
These things happen.
There you go. One of the challenges of being a minister's bird. I don't know. Everybody
Something
wants
like
to be on the live stream. Right. Good night, everybody. God bless.